everybody. Good to have you back again. We're into the writings, what they call the writings in the Old Testament. And we're glad to have you here with us. We're going into now these writings, or if you remember a couple of lessons ago, we called it the Ketuvim. The Ketuvim is a Hebrew word that means the writings. And the writings are poems and psalms and prayers that are given, and these collections are put together, which includes the Psalms and the Proverbs and the Chronicles and Nehemiah and Ezra. And these things are put together then by the writers. And so we're going to have you get ready for this class now. You want to be able to go to Ezra and Nehemiah in your Bible. You want to be able to get Lamentations. In Lamentations, you want chapter 1, you want chapter 2 and chapter 3. We're going to cover those. And then in Ezra, chapter 1 is where you want to be. And we'll go to chapter 4 and then some verses later on in 4. And then in Nehemiah, chapter 1 again, chapter 5, and then chapter 13. So you get all that now then? Lamentations, chapter 1, 3, 1, 2, and 3. Ezra, chapter 1, 3, 4, and following, and then in Nehemiah chapter 1, 5, and 13. Okay, you ready to go? Let's get going. Okay, so now what we know about the writings, as I mentioned before, they're a collection of poems, prayers, proverbs, and psalms. And Lamentations is a lamenting over Jerusalem. You know, after 587, 586, the fall of Jerusalem, then the people were despondent. They had been taken away from by the Babylonians. They had lost their city. Jerusalem had been sacked. The temple had been destroyed. And now here they are in a distant land. And some time has gone by. As much as 50 years have gone by now. And they haven't seen their beloved Jerusalem, the city of David, Zion, you know, the temple. Remember now, important thing to them is that the temple represents the very presence of God. That's where God resided. That was his house that they had built for him, that Solomon had built for the Lord, as subscribed by David and moved to give it to his son because God would have his son Solomon to do it. Okay, but that's gone now. It's been torn down. It's like going back home to your home city and wanting to go back and look at the house that you grew up in, all fond memories, but it's been torn down, been sacked. That's their feelings, only it's heightened by the fact that's where they worship God, and God is no longer there for them. All right, so now then what we find here is that Ezra and Nehemiah are also ascribed to have been written by the chroniclers, or the chronicler. Remember we talked about that in 1 Chronicles and then 2 Chronicles, but now there's a belief that the person, the writer of the Chronicles, is also maybe the writer of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we're going to see some consistency going on there. But now times have changed. And we get into Ezra and Nehemiah, they're returning back. They're coming back. And you would think there'd be all kinds of joy and celebration, but not necessarily so because of what they found. Okay, so let's get into it now. The first thing I want us to do is to turn to Nehemiah. Lamentations. Go to Lamentations first. Because in the order chronologically, Lamentations comes first because it happens after 587, 586 BC when the temple has been destroyed and the people have been taken away. And they are lamenting over Jerusalem. They are sad and remembering with great pain Jerusalem. So I want you to go to Lamentations now, chapter 1, and I want you to feel what these people were feeling. There are raw emotions that are put into the Bible. There are true feelings. Sometimes it's difficult to even hear what they're saying, but they're true feelings on what they're feeling, and they put it all down. And we are blessed to hear their feelings. Okay, so let's go into Lamentations chapter 1 and go in to see what we find here. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 1 and following. We'll probably go down through verse 11. How lovely sits the city, how lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was so great among the nations. She that was a prince among the princesses has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile and suffering and hard servitude. She lives now among the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. Now see, they have been taken away. That's what we're talking about here. The roads to Zion, Jerusalem, mourn, for no one comes to the festival. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan, her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter. Her foes have become the masters. Her enemies prosper, because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away captives before the foe. Hear the sadness and the despondency of this writer. From daughter Zion has departed all her majesty. Her princes have become like stags that find no pastures. They fled without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem members, in the days of her affliction and wandering, all that perished things that were her in her old days, when her people fell into the hand of the foe, and there was no one to help her. The foe looked and mocking down her downfall. Jerusalem sinned grievously, so that she has become a mockery. All who honor her despise her now, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Her downfall was appalling, with none to comfort her. O Lord, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. Enemies have stretched out their hands over all her perished things, all her precious things. She has even seen the nations invade her sanctuary, those who forbid to enter her congregation. So that's the depth of what they are going down through now, is that this beloved city, the roads used to be filled with people coming to the various festivals during the course of the year, are now empty. The sacred things that were in the sanctuary are now gone. The people who were in there never would have been allowed in there, because they were not ascribed or called to. And so we find some of the depths of her despair. Let's go on over now to verse 14. But we find out now why Jerusalem is in such despair. We find it, verse 14. My transgressions were bound into a yoke. By his hands they were fastened together. They weigh on my neck, sapping my strength. The Lord handed me over to those whom I cannot withstand. The Lord has rejected all her warriors in the midst of me. He proclaimed a time against me to crush my young men. The Lord had trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter Judah, which is a lower tribe, southern tribe. For these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my courage. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob. His neighbors should become his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. Now we're starting to find out that God is calling this to happen. God is calling us into being. Verse 18, the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and behold my suffering. My young women and young men have gone into captivity. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city while seeking food to revive their strength. See, O Lord, how distressed I am. My stomach churns, my heart is wrung within me, because I have been very rebellious. In the city the sword bereaves, and the house is like death. So it was because of their sins. There's a misunderstanding or misperception of God, and God is this great Santa Claus in the sky who always does nothing but good, never does anything to ever harm or hurt us. That's a misunderstanding of God. Our God is a just God, and justice sometimes requires punishment, and justice sometimes requires correction. And because God is a just God, then sometimes he either allows, or in this case, the chronicler who's writing the Lamentations is saying, God's doing this. And he's doing it because of my disobedience. So I always want to be obedient. There's one other I want us to go to, and that's over in chapter 3. In chapter 3, mine says, God's steadfast love endures. And I'm going to start in verse 13, because there's a song that's beloved by many in the traditional church that we find here. In chapter 3, verse 13, he says, he shot into my vitals the arrows of his quiver. I have become a laughingstock of all my people, the object of their taunt songs all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory and all that I hope for from the Lord. The thought of my affliction and my homelessness, get that, homelessness, is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. And here we start getting to the interesting part. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. You see, there's always a matter of hope in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of what one might think is their worst situation. There is still hope. The steadfast of the Lord is never ceasing. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Isn't that something? And so we get to understand now that song, Great is Thy Faithfulness, didn't come out of a sense of everything was going well. It came out of a person's despair, despondency, at the lowest point in their life. And so the message to us then is, great is his faithfulness. Meaning that when we are going through difficult times, and we may feel like at our lowest, he is still faithful. He is still trustworthy. And so we want to keep that in mind. All right, so that takes us and getting a sense of then what was going on at that time of lamentation or lamenting over Jerusalem after the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonians have taken them away. Now, let's shift into the other part. The other part is very, very much, very better than what we've had just now in the depths of their despair. The next phase is their return. And there's 4 stages of their return. There's Cyrus in 538 BC by Sheshbazzar, who was the Hebrew who led them back. And then after that was Darius. And there was Zerubbabel. He was the Hebrew who helped lead them back in again. And then Artaxerxes in 464 through 423. And then Nehemiah we find in 404 through 358. Okay, so we're going to look at these stages of their return and them coming back. So the first thing we want to do is now is go to Ezra. Ezra, we're starting to have now the rule of Cyrus, the Persian king. Now what's interesting is that in the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they ruled by force. They ruled by might and sometimes by just brutality and just threat of people's lives to keep them in fear. But in the Persians, when they took over power in that region that the Holy Land is in, then the Persians had a different approach to those who they conquered. They were benevolent. They let them worship their own God. And so we have Cyrus now, the Persian king, who is now allowing them to come back and worship their own God. So now let's go to Ezra, chapter 1, starting in verse 1. It says, in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in a written edict declared this, quote, thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem and Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them. and now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem, and all survivors, in whatever place they reside, be assisted by the king in their place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem. So now, awesome. God delivers. God is always a God of delivering his people. And so although they have been in exile, in this case for 50 years, God is still loyal to his people. And so never be discouraged beyond understanding that God still loves you, and God is going to restore you regardless of whatever happens, okay? So understand that he is a restorer, he is a deliverer. But what we want to find here is the fact that now we have in Ezra, we have King Cyrus of Persia ready to return the people back. And so that's the first stage of what's going on. And I want to continue on now, verse 5 down through 8. The heads of the family of Judah and Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin were the southern two kingdoms, and then all the rest of the tribes were in the northern kingdom called Israel. Okay, the priest of the, okay, let's go start with verse 5 again. The heads of the family of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites. That's important. They combine both the priests and the Levites together as a joint unity in serving God's people. The priests and Levites. Everyone whose Spirit of God has stirred got ready to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Let's pause there again. You don't want people who don't have a heart, who don't have a desire to do it. Because what they'll do is they'll drag you back down. Because they don't have a heart in the first place. Maybe you can talk them into doing something. When push comes to shove, they aren't going to be there. They're going to have 10 excuses why they can't help you, why they can't be there for you. And so what's very critical here is they got the people whose heart God has stirred, got ready to go up and rebuild the house of Jerusalem. Continue on, verse 6. All their neighbors aided them with silver vessels and with gold and with goods, with animals, and with valuable gifts. Besides all that was freely offered, free will offerings. King Cyrus himself brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. King Cyrus of Persia had them released into the charge of Methodah, the treasurer, who had counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So Sheshbazzar was the one who was responsible for taking these back. And what's interesting here, the things that had been taken away from by Nebuchadnezzar and the valuable artifacts that went into the temple are now given back. It also tells us whatever has been taken away can be returned because of your faithfulness to God. Okay, so I want you to see here that Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, is the one who was given charge to return this. Okay, now let's go over to chapter 3, because it's interesting here is the first thing you would think that they would build a temple first and get all of the appointments in there second, and then they would start worshiping. No, that's not true. They worship before they start to rebuild. In chapter 3 of Ezra, verse 1. When the 7th month came, and Israel were in his towns, the people gathered together in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, king of Jozadak, with his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and with his kin, set out to build the altar of God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as prescribed in the laws of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring people, and they offered burnt offerings upon it to the Lord morning and evening. And they kept the festival of the booths as prescribed, and offered the burnt offerings daily by number according to the ordinances as required for each day. And after the regular burnt offerings, the offerings of the new moon, and at the sacred festivals of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who had made free will offerings to the Lord. And so they established worship first. And so what it tells us then, before things are restored sometimes and rebuilt, we are to worship. because God is going to be faithful, and He is faithful, and we have to understand that's how He operates. So they started worshiping before they even rebuilt it, or rebuilt the temple. Okay, so they had some resistance. Now this is a very intriguing part. Over in chapter 4 of Ezra, it says, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the family and said to them, let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him even since the days of King Ezra of Assyria, which is way back, and brought us here. But Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel said to them, you shall have no part with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia had commanded. What's interesting is the first time I saw this, they already knew they were adversaries. And then interesting. Verse 1, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard of the return, then all of a sudden they want to approach. Well, what does that tell us? Sometimes what seems like help isn't help. Sometimes those who appear to be on our side are not really on our side. They heard that these are going on, and so it leads one to believe that maybe they had another agenda. And it wasn't to help the people of Israel. It was to get involved in the building project, to frustrate it, and to cause them to become despondent and not to actually get it completed. But what's really interesting here, and they say here, but for Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the family, so all of them got together in Israel and said to them, you shall have no part with us in building a house to our God. They were going to do it themselves. They were going to handle it because they knew they were not people of God, that they really didn't have a good agenda, and they obviously had some sort of a hidden agenda, so it's better to have no help from them than to have them involved and frustrate their efforts. So we find that there was a rebuilding. Now what's interesting here is, I said before in the Bible study class, people who are against you are not passive, they are proactive. When they're against you, they're not going to just sit by and hope you fail. They're going to try to help you fail. And so what we find, these people who were problems in chapter 4, verse 7, is interesting. Watch this. In the days of Artaxerxes, Beshlam, and Methodiah, and Tabeel, and the rest of their associates wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. Ruham, the royal deputy, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes as follows. Verse 9, then Ruham, the royal deputy, Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of their associates, the judges and the envoys and the officials, the Persians, the people of Iraq, and the Babylonians, the people of Susa, that is, the Elamites, and the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Ashapar deported and settled in the cities of Samaria and in the rest of the provinces beyond the river wrote. And they have a copy in there. So they got a copy of the letter. And the letter goes on in verse 11. To Artaxerxes, your servants, the people of the province beyond the river, sent greetings. And now may it be known to the king that the Jews who came back from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and wicked city, and they are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now may it be known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, customs, or toil, and the royal revenue will be reduced. Now, because we share the salt of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor. Therefore we sent and informed the king, so that you may search, there may be found in the annals of your ancestors. You shall discover in the annals that this is a rebellious city, hurtful to the kings and the promises, and that the sedition was stirred up in it from long ago. On that account, the city was laid to waste. And so then they're telling them, this is what happened. King, you better watch these people, because if they build this city, they're going to do the same thing they did before. And so they try to supplant what is going on. And so we find then that, there are people who will come against you. And it's just the nature of people. It's how they are. And when they're envious, then they're going to try to work against your recovery, against your progress. And you just need to be aware of that. It happened back in 587 BC, and people have not changed in 2013. So don't be, maybe you may be shocked or maybe dismayed or discouraged, but understand this has always been that way. You are a child of God, and if God has called you to restoration, you are going to be restored. Okay, so let's see what else we have here. Let's get to Darius in Ezra chapter 6. Okay, in Ezra chapter 6, we have Darius, and he's another king. So in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, when King Darius made a decree, they searched the archives where the documents were stored in Babylonia, but it was in Eshpatana, the capital of the province of Media, that the scroll was found, in which it was written a record in the first year of King Cyrus, issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices are offered and burnt offerings are brought. Its height shall be, and he gives the thing of it, the dimensions of it. But what I want to conclude with, though, is the fact that when they sent this letter to get them to stop, God then makes a way for them to find the records that say that it should go forward. And so there's going to be some delays every once in a while in our progress. That's normal and natural. And what makes the difference between those who fulfill what God would have for them are those who understand this is just a delay. This is not the end. And there's always going to be delays along any journey. You travel somewhere, what do? You stop every once in a while, don't you, and get gas. So in any journey, there's going to be delays. And when those delays happen, don't be discouraged. You just keep going on. The last part then, and I'll let you read that for yourself, is when you get over to Nehemiah, and we now have the rebuilding of the wall. Very touching account, especially in chapter 1, verse 1 through 11. I'll let you read that. And then go to chapter 5, verses 1 and following, and then chapter 13 and 4. There's so much in here. So much for you to learn. And the wonderful thing about it is that when you learn this, it blesses your life. It gives you insight. You understand God more. You understand what he has done. And what he has done is always watched after his people, which means he will always watch after you. All right, now, we want you to keep reading. We want you to stay informed. We want you to grow in your faith, grow in your strength, and be prosperous in your life. All right? Take care. We'll see you the next time. And come on back and learn some more. Take care.